Okay, so welcome, and I'm back with Essay. And we're going to talk about the philosophy king and liberalism and what kind of regime would be suitable for the emergence of the philosophy king, we could say. I'm not sure if that's a good framing. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, okay. So I'm overjoyed to be back in the Agon. Their host is always Owen, or also I think it's known as Raymond K. Hessel in certain publications. I wanted to give it just a little anecdote at the beginning. I used to write into something called the Agony Uncle column, Agony Uncle, in the London Financial Times, written by somebody called Sir David Tang. And one time I wrote in and he published it, and then he wrote back, this is the most agonized response I've ever got. So I said, so let's have a agony of experience, trial ordeal contest. But okay, so the beginning, I wanted to start, what the themes I wanted to work with were um, uh, the philosophy king, which is a big theme. So at any direction to start it with, and liberalism. So I have to start somewhere. So let me kind of build up like a brick, making using bricks that I get here and there. Uh, so Leo Strauss says Socrates says Plato is the only one who's spent his entire life, so he lived to be very old, presenting um, the way of life of a wise man, which is Socrates. And one could say one um, notion of philosopher king would be Socrates, or one notion of, say you start with liberalism. So I'm trying to superimpose the idea of liberalism over this. The original notion of liber, Liber, I think in Latin, but maybe also in, I'm not sure what the corresponding word is in Greek. But if you go back to the etymologically and historically to the beginning of the idea of liberalism, projecting it back before the time period of the French Revolution when it was actively used in politics, um, you get this idea of the life worthy of a free man. And then you could link that to Aristotle saying that Fusus, so Fusus and liberty are basically the same in Aristotle, and they kind of like autonomy and Kant. They're what something, a stone, a human being, anything would do when not perversely interfered with, would not subjected to the so-called heteronomous forces in the Kantian version, or to Das Man, and I think to Das Man in the Heideggerian version. But so what would a human being do if it were not constrained by bad weather, or by defective human beings, or by anything? How would it live? And then Socrates is one example of that. So I think that gives some sort of orientation towards the type of project Plato was thinking of when he thought of the philosopher king. So there's a lot more to be said in detail about how Plato himself brought up the subject of, it's actually Basilius is the word he uses in um, the Politeia, or I think it could be called just the polity in English. The word Hobbes uses the polity, or the republic, so-called. But there's a lot to be said about that. I don't know if you have any thoughts. I know that you did some presentations on the Guardians. I don't know if you did a presentation on the Philosopher King previously.
Yeah, sounds cool. Yeah, so the videos on the Guardians, I've been trying to kind of delve into that spirited thymotic guardian side to Plato's overall schema, because I think that's probably the part that kind of modern liberal societies, or any modern society really, seems to neglect. So for me, I kind of didn't, I didn't properly link that to the philosophy king. But in Plato, I know that the philosophy king is chosen from the guardian, so you have to go through that, right? If I'm not mistaken, you have to go through
And
that.
there's stages. There's stages, but some of the Guardians are more logos types than others. I think some are
Mm.
more like guard nodes.
Yeah, and like there's also like something I'm writing on at the moment, but I'll hopefully publish sometime, maybe before maybe sometime next year, early next year maybe. But it's this, there's a kind of balance also there between kind of warlike courage and philosophic wisdom. There's a sort of principled kind of, there's like oppositions which are trying to be principally, like they're two principles which are opposed to each other, but they're trying to be harmonized. And like I think Plato's trying to perceive of that kind of in an educational form. At least the Philosopher King would move through that, you know. And that's definitely something we've neglected in kind of modern education, because we tend to put the cerebral intelligent people in one camp and the kind of physical people in
Right. So
another camp.
that's in a way exemplified by the split already in antiquity between Cicero and Plato. So Cicero studied at the academy in I think it's in the first century BC. So Socrates died in 399, so it's several hundred years later. But Cicero then wrote a kind of an answer to Plato's Republic, where he said the problem with the philosopher king is that he doesn't know how to manipulate people. He doesn't know how to do politics in this, politics taken just in the vernacular sense of like what Putin does, or he doesn't know how to
Realpolitik stuff.
yeah, realpolitik. And so that Cicero said that's a problem with the Platonic version, or that's one of the essential problems. But I think that shows the split between these kind of two skill sets. Maybe, and the philosopher would also, in a certain way, you'd want the philosopher to be. There's a long discussion about it, like whether the philosopher is totally pure of heart or whether the philosopher understands ruthless motivation sufficiently that he can identify it like a good judge, sense what wickedness is and what its impulses are, but nonetheless not reseduced by them. And so sometimes Dugin says, for instance, in this connection, that the problem with we philosophers, referring to himself, is that we're too nice. He said too nice. So then, so I think, yeah, that is a big theme to be,
Yeah. Yeah. And like you mentioned, the kind of potentiality or fulfillment, kind of Plato trying to conceive of a society in which the free man, I suppose, would be kind of not fulfilled in the modern sense of like I'm fulfilled because I don't know what, like I have a good
I
relationship
would
and a
say
good
that the
job, but
sense
like
closer to us is, the sense closer to us is build on, is education in the full sense, like life
yeah,
education. But closer to Plato and Aristotle, the sense is, so actually, just to make that even more clear, Strauss says an example of Bildung is the, I think it's called The Education of Henry Adams. Henry Adams is a scion or some distant offspring of John Adams, one of the American founders, who lived during the time when he said Darwin was quote unquote convulsing the circles he moved in, which would be like Boston Brahmin circles, they called the people that ran the country, America in those days. But also he went back and forth to Britain, and that book shows the total meaning of education, like his whole life and everything is learning his whole life build on. But in the Plato Aristotle more basic setting, I think what they were first thinking of, because both Plato and Aristotle mentioned this, is the hierophants, the Egyptian hierophants, or we translate priest, but it's kind of, maybe there's a lot of problems with that translation, who first did mathematics because they were freed up from all the bodily concerns. And that's a big, see, that's, that brings in the Nietzschean thing, like Nietzsche wants to go back to the body, but the philosopher king wants to abstract from the body in a certain sense. And this is why the Thomas More called it a utopia later on. I think Thomas More is like, I don't remember, sometime before 1900, I can't remember, but in modernity, they got the same utopia. But I think for Plato and Aristotle, they tried to, since, these mathematicians, Egyptian mathematicians, Pythagorean, these are real people doing real mathematical work. It's not just something that doesn't exist, but then they want to include more that looks like it's going more towards the agathon or the good. And then there's also certain practical things like exercise, things like that.
Yeah, like it's surprising if you read a lot of Plato's work that concentrates more on education, or like it's not even education, like it's kind of elite pedagogy or something. Like, these dialogues where like lashes or lysis, which they're trying to teach friendship, and you kind of have Socrates trying to teach, like he's trying to
Lacus
instruct.
is on courage, or I think that's the on courage. Right? Lacus is
Lashes is courage, lysis is friendship, Charmides
okay.
is prudence, and there's probably more.
Which I think prudence is phronesis, I think, which is the key thing that Socrates is supposed to be credited with. Rather than being a sage, he's a phronesis, I think.
Yeah, and like in Lashes, he sort of operates as this person who tries to harmonize. Like it's the discussion is like, what is courage? And you have two military generals discussing courage, like but like, is courage standing your ground, or is it having good tactical knowledge? And you kind of have this basic dialectic between these two different views of courage. But like what's actually going on in a sense too is that Socrates is trying to harmonize like action and kind of words, if you get me. Like I think this is called the Dorian mode or something like that, but it's like
Oh yeah, that's interesting. That adjective is yeah, which is often used in connection to the Spartans or the Lacedaemonians. And it's
okay,
also
yeah,
been coming up in this connection to this. I looked at this thesis, by the way, of how's the guy's called? Olimaru. What's his name?
yeah,
The guy
yeah,
that
I know, yeah,
Bronze Age Bronze Age pervert's actual name apparently, but he
yeah,
came out with this Kostin Vlad Olimaru. He came out with this thesis on the. It had some long title involving Nietzsche originally, and but he packaged it for the book and called it something like selective breeding and the beginning of nature or something like that. But I read the first 100 pages of it, and it was yeah, those themes come into it because it's I find it interesting because he's Straussian and he's read all of Strauss and he's using all
yeah.
these themes that are heavily close to Plato. Good solid work with Plato from Strauss, then
Yeah.
developed this path thing. Although I don't agree with the thesis, but I still think the subject matter he uses forces us to look at some issues that Strauss wanted people to look at, which is good.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a kind of like the next maybe I don't know how long, next decade or two is going to be kind of good readings, like rereadings of Plato, because I think the academic readings of Plato have kind of hit a limit and run dry, and now you need kind of outside the institution people to do that now.
Yeah,
So
maybe that would be very powerful in this coming century because it's. I was thinking of the like in Strauss and Carl Schmitt, they have the shared understanding, and I think it was larger than just them of European centuries. The way of thinking in terms of centuries, by the way, is like only post French Revolution, just like usually talking all the time about. They tried to make months into like 10 months and into a metric system and stuff like that. But they characterized the century of 16th. I think I mentioned this last time we talked, but I'm wondering if it can be extended based on just exactly what you're just saying about this kind of discussion we're having now and the media in general, because they talk about 16th century as the theological century because of the Reformation, and 17th century metaphysics, Descartes, 18th century the moral century because of Rousseau and Kant, das Sollen, or the ought, is ought distinctive. Hume also involved, and then 18th century economics, and I think no, sorry, maybe I'm getting it a little bit wrong, but as we get up to our own century, we go through economic century with, yeah, 19th century economics with Marx, 20th century, the authority, I guess, really it's authority, the authority of the scientific view. But I think now that in the 21st century, that the authority of the scientific view is waning to some extent.
yeah.
There could come in a new, we're unthematized. I mean, we're just in the first quarter of the century, and we don't know what the dominant authority of the century will be. And with this vast social media thing, with so many people participating in it, that could be the center of it.
Yeah, I agree that there's definitely it's an open question, and there's room for something beyond those kind of economistic and scientific authorities. But just to return to the kind of educational question of like Plato's kind of ideal of like educating and like kind of cultivating people, that obviously these aren't like just random people as well. They're kind of elite young Athenian men. They're like Alcibiades or Lysis. They're sort of like men that are supposed to kind of rule one day and so on. So there's this kind of as you know, it's very classical education. It's very holistic as well, because you have all these different sorts of music, physical activity, math. You've got all these kind of components in the Republic being integrated into each other into one big educational system. But obviously it's different to the bourgeois one, because the bourgeois one, I don't feel like it's geared to kind of replenishing elites, if you get me. It's kind of gearing people for the workplace and for like general civic life in a moderate sense. It's not kind of gearing
Well,
people
yeah.
for like
I mean,
for
I think the bourgeois period, starting with the Biedermeier period in Prussia about like 1820 or so, it's undergone a number of changes. So like Carl Schmitt in his writings on the Partisan mentions this curious example that in 1870, which is like in the heart of the like when the bourgeois are really flourishing and becoming more powerful, like that lawyers and doctors were extremely respected in that time. And the example he gives, of course, because he's a realpolitik type of guy and thinking about military matters, he gives this example that the French during the Franco-Prussian War would take captives from the top of the most respectable of the bourgeois. And the population so respected the most respectable among the bourgeois that the that was like those were captives that would stop the general population from attacking them while they were occupying Prussian cities. But you could see like that today that probably wouldn't work because people don't have that today. It's not like Hamas. I don't know what the current example would be, but it's just there's not that respect for bourgeois anymore. There's not that respect for, we called it like the professional classes, I guess. There's not that respect for
kind
the
of
professional
PMC.
classes because there's such a, I mean, there's so much pride movements, so to speak, among working class, and there's not like there's actually like maybe there's just in some sense, there's the hate of certain there's such a split between professional classes and other people today in a way. I think, for instance, like I think I thought of that when Kissinger died recently. There's like this vast outcry of hate towards Kissinger, but then anybody who's kind of in America, at least anyone who's kind of plugged into the so-called political classes at a higher level has to they feel compelled to praise Kissinger. Because
Yeah,
there's like
yeah.
a split of culture here.
Yeah, I feel like also because that bourgeois upper class is being kind of replaced by kind of a kind of managerial class, and they don't have that same sense of like, like a doctor or a lawyer. They're kind of obvious roles and obvious professions where like if you work in, human resources for some corporation, it's like, what do you really do? No one really knows, no one really knows what you do. You're just kind of a suit or a bureaucrat that kind of has this
Yeah,
privileged position.
I think that's a big thing about the trying to thematize what liberalism is. So Benjamin Constant in 1819, speaking against the other thematizers of liberalism, such as Montesquieu, said that one thing he said that's very simple is that the ancients were kind of poor compared to the the French of that time, who had a lot of very interested in industry and living comfortably, but that the ancients had to manage their own affairs, which thereby this notion that the ancient participation in public things. But modern man wants to be entrepreneurial and to be free to be entrepreneurial. So this is like in the current theme, like in the current politics of libertarianism, and they want just to be let to do their commercial activity. So if somebody is becoming wealthy through commercial activity, this is liberalism in the sense of I think the way Strauss states it is it's a kind of individualism, but individualism is such a vague word. But it's where you um, stand and kind of look at society from outside it, in a certain you exercise a certain personal freedom for society. So social contract, starting with Hobbes and this kind of thing. The idea that the individual is actually had the phrase that Strauss written down. It's not that important, but it's kind of nice to have the way he states it. An independence towards society, something in every man by virtue of which he is not wholly subject to society and to the majority will or to what have you, he says. So, like, the current elites, managerial, I mean, I know you tie in managerial elites to some extent to this kind of Schallhart Gehausa of Max Weber, like the steel hard rationality, instrumental rationality, sort of this kind of, I think they call it also steel cage of rationality, of the modern rationality. But also, I think it has to do with this, invisible hand logic and this notion of, I think that maybe that's the theme of Sloterdijk. I read that book on cynical reason a long time ago, but I'm not exactly sure what he's thinking of there. But the idea of Bill Clinton would still use the idea of, and I think Obama used the idea of doing well by doing good, meaning you go into business for yourself for mercenary reasons, but supposedly it ends up helping everyone, just like the invisible hand is this idea that you'll go private vices, public benefits, you become active, but it helps everyone. But so, like, those people, unlike the 19th century top bourgeois, were not thinking of duty towards the rest of the country, but instead today everybody's supposed to be thinking of, this is something Dugin brings out, that he's against liberalism for this reason. They're supposed to be like not part of society, and everyone is supposed to be their own hero and for themselves and whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like an antagonism towards the rest of society, which is supposed to be good for it, but this is very difficult problem.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of Patrick Deneen, his critiques of liberalism, because he kind of goes from this. He's kind of inspired by like Christopher Lasch and Philip Reeve and these people who have this view of elites that are just trying to kind of liberate themselves from any sort of responsibility towards their society. They kind of
that's like liquid society, free floating, cosmopolitan elites, no country. So yeah.
But like the funny thing is, they're not even that cosmopolitan in the traditional sense of the word. Like they're not like well read or anything. They're not really interested
Oh
in
yeah. But
in
I
like
just meant the
worldly
floating around
cultures.
from capital to capital.
Yeah.
The Paris one week and London the next week and Beijing the next week and Dubai the next.
Yeah, sure. But yeah. So you had these kind of these managerial elites
And
who,
houses all over the world.
and like I think a lot of the kind of excessive liberal ideology, like wokeism and that kind of thing, is very much geared towards like liberating a group of elites from any responsibility with anything, like a country or a people or even a kind of ethical role, right? Like,
I don't know, because I think that's the mixed case. I don't know, because if I think of somebody like Judith Butler here in UC Berkeley, I think, what her issue is just like, she had some friends that are LGBT plus whatever, and then she thinks, they're having trouble, I'm having trouble, and then we want more rights, and then they're just like a sectional interest in the community, and then that plus the fact that since we have no agreement on what the morals can be, so since we have the fact value distinction, and values are supposed to be subjective, then somehow the value of some kind of a love match or sexual fulfillment becomes like an ultimate thing. And then that's one form of it. So even Putin says, okay, we exist de facto because of sex. And then there's always in every community some homosexuals and some other people, but according to Putin, they shouldn't predominate. But then in a liberal society where everyone's supposed to have equal rights, and the isothermia, um, then they could push that and say, well, we're supposed to have equal rights, as we can't consider the good of the whole, but rather everybody on their own foot, as I just said, like looking at exercising their independence from the majority will. There's certain independence towards society, demands like their full rights. So I think there's a lot in the LGBT plus stuff. There's a lot of sort of there's something in liberalism itself and its principle of the individual being. I mean, the basic principle is like the state versus society, which Carl Schmitt draws out. It was originally a polemical term because of absolutism and Louis XIV and so on. That's like it's like a fissure in society, and then this anti-liberals like Schmitt and like Dugin tried to bring back the unity, I think, the primitive unity, because that's the social contract is the origin of that in Hobbes, but then also developed in Locke and Rousseau.
Well, like on the kind of topic of elite education, there's a noticeable distinction between these whatever managerial elites and kind of more classically bourgeois elites, in the sense that the managerial elites don't feel like they don't really care about high culture in any way, and they don't care about reading classical text anyway. They kind of see it as just pointless, or stupid or something, like it's and that's quite worrying to me, because even if you have a kind of bourgeois cosmopolitan personality who doesn't have like a strong sense of nationalism or a strong sense of community, at least they have a sense of like duty or to like ethics or like the culture or something like that, like whereas this managerial elite doesn't have any sort of duty to nation or community, but it also doesn't care about culture and history. It doesn't care about these things. It's awful.
Well, so like in that Constant speech from 1819, like he basically disregards time and just says, like, even already in ancient Athens, this split was happening between the commercial culture, which is more liberal, and the culture that came before. But in Athens, because it was small, like everybody could feel their weight. And like I think of like a community of kind of acquaintances where everyone could actually speak out and kind of feel their weight as a citizen. But because we're such large countries, like France already was, and Constant was giving the speech, there, it's just not possible because of the scale, I think.
Yeah.
And but it's the same thing in a different way, is that the shift from, I think, about the year 1600, there stopped being things like knights roving around so much, and there became more things became more and more a matter of commercial life being more important, because the destruction of property, even though we have this thing called it's complex, we have this thing called the industrial military complex and all that, and yes, people make money from that. Nonetheless, on the whole, I think people, oligarchs are going to make more money in peace because they can commerce. Because whenever there's a war, like you always hear these things like trillions of dollars of property is destroyed, right? A whole city is destroyed. And yeah, even Schmitt gives a number of examples on that. I'll give you an example from Schmitt. Solon, the guy's name is Raoul Solon, a French general from the in Algeria, was the most highly decorated general, I think, in the French army at the time. Was caught in this situation where they had like 400,000 troops, and they were fighting the partisan or guerrilla force in Algeria, which is only like maybe 20,000 or something. But the property damage was just tremendous. And yeah, eventually the politicians said, just give up Algeria, because the property damage was too great, even though they were militarily totally dominant. And it was just better to give up the colony and stop the bleeding. A connected example that maybe brings that out more clearly, I think, it's a really interesting essay by Yukio Mishima is where he's describing World War II. Another French general, Philippe Pétain, the so-called Lion of Verdun in the First World War. In the Second World War, he surrendered Paris basically because he thought, like, the way I understand it is he thought they were going to probably lose anyway because they're being overrun by the Germans, and he thought, why let Paris be totally destroyed? Why not just surrender it and let Paris be preserved? Mishima's comment is, so this is kind of on the theme of Schmittian theme of like pacification. He thought, well, let's. Mishima says they saved the cultural objects, all the whole of the city of Paris, but they killed their whole spirit. They doing that.
Yeah. It's like the opposite to what happened with the Russians and Napoleon. It's like they burned down Moscow. Like
Right, right, exactly. Yeah,
in
that's
order
right.
to
That's a
save
great
face.
example. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
um,
In order
so
to save their spirit, save their spirit. Yeah, it also saved their whole will and spirit and
yeah,
seriousness of the people.
yeah.
I think that's another way I wanted to. Sorry, that's another way I wanted to thematize this is that there's this move that Mishima and I think Schmidt and Strauss in their own way are showing is the museum, and Agamben is big on this, is museumification of
Yeah.
culture, so that culture just becomes something, oh, it's expensive and we want to save it and it's brittle, instead of the model of how to be a Japanese or how to be a Russian or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think also this on this philosopher king thing, that's why I started with the idea of Socrates as Plato's whole career is showing how to be a phronimos, or how to be a philosopher, or how to be the eudaimonia person. It was Socrates. It's living culture. It's something that looks back into us when we read it and shows us something, instead of just like
Mm.
an object in a museum or a diamond or something being protected by a guard.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like I was actually writing something about the move today from touching to looking. Like everything is looked at through screens, and it's like the same thing in museums. It's like don't touch it. You can only look at it, right? It's
Yeah,
just like a
and even they put
sublimation.
it behind glass too, which
Yeah,
really disturbed me. Is they put the Van Gogh paintings behind glass in the museums in San Francisco recently. A couple, well, it was a number of years ago.
yeah. Well, like that's what's so interesting about Plato's dialogues is because they are quite historical. Like a lot of the characters were real historical people, but you don't feel like you're looking at a museum piece. Like you feel like you're involved in the kind of
Yeah,
situation that they're in. Yeah, so it's a kind of different historical. It's a whole different historical
yeah.
experience.
I mean, Strauss says the Platonic dialogue. He puts on the chalkboard a question mark, and he says Platonic dialogue is never something where you could just have a list of propositions or a scholar that knows everything in the Platonic dialogue, but it's a question. And once you start probing, you find all these difficulties that are alive and that force you to look at problems that seemingly would still arise if we would ask questions like, what is justice today, just as Plato did, at the time.
Yeah. Um, so the other theme I wanted to touch on was the because we were talking about the 21st century and the authority of the 21st century. Like, what's the authority going to be of the 21st century? And there definitely seems to be a push for kind of self-improvement. If you get me, like there's a kind of emphasis on which is very different to like the late 20th century suddenly and like the very early 21st century, like 2000s 2010s, like with somewhere within the
You mean like in
2010s.
terms of fitness and things like that, or?
Well, like the whole, like, Jordan Peterson get fitness, like not watching pornography,
I see,
not
like self-help. Yeah. So yeah.
yeah. Like, but like there is a vulgar form of this in the kind of self-help, but I also think that like it may be tapping into something what Peter Sloterdijk refers to as vertical tension. So it's like there's a tension within us which is kind of vertical. There's a better and worse versions of ourselves, and I think liberalism tends to try to sort of level that to, it's like all options are equally valid, all habits, all ways of seeing things are equally valid, especially postmodernism. And then I think, within that, so is it like, I think there might be a response to that now
Difference rather
saying,
than hierarchy. Yeah.
yeah, difference rather than hierarchy, but like, I feel like there is something implicit within the kind of Jordan Peterson and the kind of self-improvement sphere, which is actually, no, there is a better way to be, and there is a worse way to be. So that is fits that I think that fits a little bit more with the classical educational model.
Well, I guess that corresponds to Kant's wager, which Leo Strauss in one lecture, I think maybe I mentioned this last time, is Strauss said, yeah, the liberalism rises or falls with free speech. And the idea being, yes, Jordan Peterson is aware of this, like that he can go out in the public sphere, and this idea of sunshine is the best disinfectant, or similar ideas, or the market will choose, like, so that for example, Kant thought that eventually there'll be a moral evolution where human beings as a species will stop telling lies. It will simply be just as it be like a physical impossibility, like gravity almost, but or at least we'll realize it as a moral principle, as we now realize the principle of equality under the law of everyone in the country, rather than the three estates, or rather than slaves and non-slaves, but total equality under the law. That's recognized. So Kant thinks also other principles like not lying, because then you can trust your fellow human beings, then compacts or contracts can be trusted, and et cetera, et cetera. He thinks there's going to be moral evolution, and that the mode of getting to that moral evolution is that people that investigate things, research things, do it, they can then come out and say, as somebody who's not just as a personal whim, but as somebody who's investigated it, this is my proposal of how it should be done. And then there'll be a selection process. And I think Kant sort of that's sort of the Kantian wager in terms of Kant's idea of liberalism.
Yeah. And what about one of the things that I often come back to the philosophy king question on is things like biotech and AI and these sorts of technologies that kind of go beyond the capacity for like scientists to understand, they surpass the consequences of them, surpass these kind of scientific
Yeah,
rationals,
the
so-called
ramification.
experts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can't tell what the results will be. I mean, I think that's also the original idea of philosophy king contains the fact that the philosophers don't necessarily know what the good is. They're just seeking it. So there's kind of an analogy between the philosophers and religious belief in that sense. The philosophers are striving for the good. The religious man is as maybe theological hope that he'll get to our faith, but neither are actually in possession of the good. So it seems like a philosopher king. There's some super subtle issues that, in contradistinction to the current polis, or the current group with the shared telos, those people have, all of us have doxa or opinions, but supposedly the philosophers present themselves as sort of being better pilots of the ship of state, right? But not necessarily as simply knowing what the good is or what the truth is. So I think that's what you're saying is kind of a version of that.
Well, like what I was hinting at there as well was like, so in a standard state of affairs, it's there's I don't think there's that much appetite for people saying, look, listen to the philosophers, they know how to do things. But when you have these technologies which are being used in certain ways, or are not being regulated in certain ways, or are not understood as things which, for example, threaten us on an ontological level, suddenly there is kind of more there's more urgency for philosophical thinking and therefore maybe philosophical authority, if you get me.
Yeah, it's very, yeah. Just it's kind of an aside, but it's kind of connected. Is that's I was thinking you wrote, or you may not remember, but it was some time ago. You did a presentation which is called something like the soft tyranny of modern medicine, and the article, I think it was an article you were reading and commenting on, but it concerned this guy Cass Sunstein, which is sort of he gets beat up a lot by Fox News, so I kind of embarrassed to attack him too much because I don't want to just like be on that bandwagon, but he has played like an oversized role in American politics as something like it doesn't seem exactly like something more almost philosophical within the hardcore of actual manipulation of like who gets on the Supreme Court in America, what policies are passed, and things like that. One of the things he was talking about in the article you were reading was the so-called nudge theory, and the
Yeah.
nudge theory does involve, and then this so-called libertarian paternalism, or however it's called, where the paternal figure is really the figure Socrates is kind of bringing out. And so not really a paternal figure, so in a way, but in a way, somebody who's like a doctor who knows what the right cure is rather than, and tries to steer people away from, I don't know. It is like a parent, like don't just eat, candy and make yourself sick, but, we as the ones that are in charge of the health of the community would want to recommend something else. But he's, that nudge theory, like that involves technology, right? So there's all kinds of ways we're being nudged when we're like online or whatever. Somebody wrote, I think said we're on the plate when we're like browsing web pages because advertisements and so on. There's so many ways we can be subliminally manipulated. Nudge theory is basically like, it means subliminal manipulation used for something good, supposedly. But the problem is, even if you don't like that, it's already happening. It's like subliminal manipulation is already happening. I mean, a simple example of that is in a store where you have something at eye level that tends to sell better than not at eye level. And if you're driving and you're going around a curve and they change the distance that the lines in the road are, it gives you the subliminal sense that you're speeding up or slowing down. So those are examples of nudges. But there's also, with all this cybernetic AI and stuff online, there must be, a huge store of nudges already happening, and then somebody has to do that. Somebody has to decide the piloting direction of that, even though it's kind of bad both ways. Or maybe it's not, if we could know what was good and actually just guide towards it. I don't know.
Like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was hinting at, that like there needs to be a pilot, there needs to be an authority, but it's I don't think anyway that you can just leave these things open to the market or some sort of like sentimental democratic impulse. But like,
well, otherwise, then corporations would decide.
Yeah, corporations, but you
Jeff
need
Bezos will
people,
decide.
but like you need people in that authority position, I think, that aren't just these sort of technical experts, because technical experts will only think in terms of, in terms of economy, in terms of kind of utilitarian quantifications and calculations. Like they're not going to think, they're not really going to think on that deeper level about, for example, biotechnology or AI. They're not going to think of like the political, ontological consequences. At most, they'll think of some ethical consequences because they'll have some sort of think tank informing them of some ethical, but like they don't have a deep level of thought. So like my hope would be that people who can deal with these technological changes from a deeper perspective, which includes the philosophical and the ontological and so on, can be this people that steer that ship, if you get me. Like that's a pipe dream, I know, but like if we're thinking of Philosophy King,
Yeah, I mean, there's a general theme of like that people say there's things that are politically feasible, and then there's the things that could be thought out carefully by a scholar or even by a thinker. But I mean, two big things. I guess two big things there would be, I think. Okay, the original idea of in Plato of Philosopher King seems to come from a 6th century BC tyrant, or he was born about 600, what we call 600 BC, Pisistratus, and the Pisistrati, his sons, who could kind of like, we could say they're kind of like the higher guardians, but then there'd be more guardians around them that were more like Roman Praetorian Guard or a foreign bodyguard. And the idea was like a tyrant, according to Leo Strauss, is like somebody you basically the population would kill if they could, but that therefore they need a bodyguard. And so that's a double of Socrates, who is there's like a debate, I think, in the literature about, and also in general about Socrates was killed because of this the overt claim that he was perverting the youth or whatever, or was it because he was actually presenting a tyrannical rule because he was claiming there's some people who know, and these people who know ought to be in charge, just as a doctor ought to be in charge instead of the various appetites of children who want to eat candy and rot their teeth or whatever. And Pisistratus is a little bit like fascism. It reminds me of, people say the Nazis built the Autobahn and they kept the trains running. Fascists in general, and they had this nice goose step with Mussolini's black shirts or whatever. And they did some things that were impressive, and likewise, Pisistratus founded some pan Athenian games, like the Olympic was similar to the Olympian games, and he built an aqueduct, and he was building up Athens, and he was engaged in cultural projects such as coming to a definitive written translation of the Iliad, which is kind of important, I think, actually, for a lot of these themes connected to, also to connect with the Almaru thesis, which is dealing with the Iliad. But, the Iliad was this long oral tradition that rhapsode, just a singer tradition, kind of like medieval troubadours or something like that, singing tradition. And then at a certain time, it started to get codified, written down, become a specific text. And just after that period, when it became a specific text, that's when Plato and Socrates could come in and say, look at this text, look at how it's misleading people, look at the words, putting us in the right direction, let's edit it further. And I think this is that links up to the Jasper's axial age idea. And it happened also in India, because that happened around that same age the Vedic period ended. And this text usually likes to talk about the part of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, where there's this discussion between Arawana and Krishna about duty and about the Dharma or whatever comes in. The same thing happened. There's a switch between or a similar thing. There was a switch between a warrior culture and then a Brahmic or a priestly culture came in, but overlaid with the movement from a language which was just a daily language, practic, to the Sanskrit, which was the hierarchic, which was the priestly language, which was consciously developed with concepts, just as to some extent in Plato, we don't really have anything that's not in common usage, but they're developed in a way that takes them out of common usage, right? Because what everyone in Athens understood by a term like dike, justice, was not the Socratic notion, that which improves the population, but it was probably a dike they understood, the law or something else. And there's so many things that go in further into here, but it's like, I think that's part of the background of the Philosopher King, is this model of the tyrant Pisistratus, and then they tried to say, what if we did this? But they said it was a philosopher who was the tyrant, and that's somebody who can get things done. And then another example of that closer to us, which Fukuyama kind of touches on the end of it, saying during the modern period, there's these defensive modernizations, and the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire were basically Platonic guardian class. They were chosen out from the population they'd look at children, like the Dalai Lama's pick, see promising children, take them away from the family, raise them in a special way. And then, Richard Bullitt, he's a historian in Columbia, University of Columbia, was a big Islam expert, has said he thinks that the Janissaries are really based on the Platonic guardian idea, but except they didn't have at the top of the guardians, they didn't have the Philosopher King.
So it's interesting kind of interpretation of Socrates and like what he did wrong was that he wasn't corrupting the youth, but he was sort of positing or trying to justify a sort of tyrannical authority. And I think you could actually back that up sometimes when you think of parts of Platonic dialogues, for example. I think it's the Republic where there's a question of justice and like there's a question of should you give a friend back a weapon. I think it's that if you give a friend back a
Right.
weapon if he's not in the right state of mind, and it's like it's not just to do that if he's not. So you have this kind of claim over being in the right state of mind or the right state of being, and the person in the right state of mind, right state of being can understand the situation or can understand the relationship to justice and so on, in a way with the person not in the right state of being.
Well, yeah,
Or
that's kind of a
mind can have.
Foucauldian thing, like
Yeah,
distinguishing between the mad and the non-mad. Yeah, that's a big
yeah.
theme. Foucault.
But like that seems quite distinct from the kind of technocratic experts who would say, like, they wouldn't be like, oh, we're in charge because we're in the right state of mind, but they would say we're in charge because we have like kind of scientific expert knowledge and we have kind of access to this data or that data, and we can kind of put it all together and make a rational decision. So it's not like they're
Right.
they're
That's
not
what. Yeah.
they're not arguing they're
Well,
in
I
the
was
right
just saying
state of
that's what I.
mind, but do they have knowledge rather than they're kind of embodying knowledge. They have knowledge, like it's a kind of property they have.
Well, I think because the idea of instrumental rationality, which I put together, that's why I put what you're saying just now about data, data, and information and technical knowledge, with the idea of the Max Weber's idea of the steel cage of so-called rationality. But by rationality, he means instrumental rationality, which means it's a means to an end, rationality. So there's something that's known how to do, or we know what the goal is, and
Okay,
then
yeah.
this is the most efficient way to do it. I think that's the basic idea, and that can be contrasted with there's all these discussions in the tradition, which are where rationality means something like eudaimonia, and it's hard to uh, clearly state in a logical way what it is, but it requires it requires sensibility in some sense. So like the justice requires, just like some people are good at a sense of art or a sense of music or a sense of piano playing or something. It requires a certain sensitivity to the subject matter, not just uh, technical knowledge.
Yeah. So like it's all like, so I would say maybe even as a kind of a, not a definition, but like an implication of like what the philosophy king process is trying to achieve. It's trying to achieve like the cultivation of people that are in the right state of mind in order to make these kind of important decisions relating to the good, if you get me.
Yeah, I mean, I think Socrates' statement of, his famous statement, at least in the Benjamin Jowett translation, which is the most prominent of the life. How does it say that the unexamined life is not worth living? Which is not exactly what he says in the text, but in any case, just that Socrates is, in other words, like to reiterate, in other words, Strauss is saying every dialogue of Plato is a picture of how you should be living if you're the philosopher, right? This is what you should be doing. You should be investigating, searching for these orientation and for the principles of how to live, which we have a vague orientation towards with the Socratic principle that justice is that which improves all the citizens, which kind of precludes something like executing you for your own good, except if you say that there's an afterlife or something. But
Yeah, no, it's definitely like the more you think about it, it's definitely so incompatible, basically, with liberal democratic societies, basically. But um,
well, let me say this is Helena Rosenblatt was so like they had before Dugin, like which is just like 2018, the most people that were talked about with respect to, at least in America, with respect to the liberal tradition. I think it was much less talked about in like Oxbridge or whatever, but there was somebody called Ronald Dworkin, who's Harvard sort of professor of law and jurist and legal philosopher. And I think his best, most beautiful speech, anyway, in this Calon, in the sense of, I think Strauss says Beyond Good and Evil was Nietzsche's, not maybe Nietzsche's most profound book, but his most beautiful book, is there truth in interpretation? It's the Ronald Dworkin speech given near the end of his life in something 2010 or thereabouts. But he's also given, basically the orientation before that was the Rawls, Jonathan Rawls against Nozick. Nozick was on the side of the libertarians, and Rawls was on the side of the liberals who wanted to help the precarious people more. And that was the basic orientation towards liberalism up until that just a few years ago, that Patrick Neen thing opened up a lot of things. And then lately, Helen Rosenblatt has been airing this stuff about Jacques Necker, who is she puts forward as the leading proponent of the French Revolution because he was a Swiss banker who was working for Louis XVI. And Louis XVI was much younger, also, I think plays a role. He's detailed with Strauss, he likes to look at the details like that. And Necker got Louis XVI to go ahead and publish certain articles about the finances of France and make it publicly known and also this article about like how does government work in France. He published something and it was like a bestseller in like the 1870s or just a few years before the French Revolution. And one of the things Jacques Necker said is the way government should work is there should be a few, like I don't know exactly what word to use, like wise, but I'll just say a few wise people should discern who are the people in the country who are the classes of people in the country that have the most difficulties are, and then what everyone else's duty is towards those people. So that's a simple formula, I think. And that was the formula Necker proposed like at the eve of the French Revolution. But obviously that's not sort of exactly what's happening now because we're more on this social contract and individual freedom sort of society pattern.
Yeah.
I think the Necker view is more like what Dugin is pointing towards, by the way.
And like, so you're probably better read on Dugin than I am. So what's Dugin's take on the philosophy king? Like for him, it's a real thing. Like it's a real possibility, right?
Well, I mean, I think he doesn't push that because I don't know, because sometimes he says, "Oh, we should go back to this medieval pattern," and he also even says, I don't know, he says that whatever contradicts his own thinking, philosophical thinking in the Orthodox Church, he'll side with the Orthodox Church. So it's like he's putting the Orthodox Church in the place of the Philosopher King, just as like I guess as the Catholics put the Pope to some extent.
Yeah, so like he's not even totally committed to it. Then he's
It's strange.
He's more a
It's very
philosophical
complicated.
advisor. I would say he's more like a philosophical advisor than a king.
I mean, in practical terms, like I noticed that. So, for instance, there's this grandiose hall, great hall in the Kremlin called something like the St. George's Hall, and Putin gave a speech there on the occasion of announcing that he's annexing these three small republics as on the edge of on the eastern edge of the Ukraine, the Novorossiya, and the Donbass and whatever else. He used a lot of rhetoric directly from, or at least some rhetoric directly from Dugin. It seemed to me in that, and it seems like he's taking certain. Dugin creates certain ways of communicating issues, like like saying, "Oh, in the West they have not the mother and the father, but the mother, the father, and I forget how he says person X or whatever. He has some way of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
explaining
You don't have like
the
a
reason
mother
that
and
they're
father. You have parent one, parent two, and so on. Yeah.
right. So it has some simple way, the verbal ways of communicating the objection of the Russians to being overrun by global liberalism and the pop. I mean, in a way, it's what Schmidt, when Schmidt attacks entertainment, he's really attacking popular culture. And so in every movie and every all popular culture, because it's trying to sell to the largest audience and not just to a niche, it tries to go with the dominant norms, and then it flattens everything out so that everything has to be kind of LGBT plus friendly, otherwise it wouldn't sell as well, maybe. And I think that Dugin is providing a lot of ways to communicate directly that Putin can use to when Putin talks to the Russians on the whole, he uses those verbal patterns to explain things that Dugin has developed.
Yeah, and like I noticed that too when I listened to that speech from Putin, that it seemed like he had read some or he'd listened to some Dugin, and that was, I think, a big moment, because I think because it meant at least the real power structures, at least in Russia, were sort of taking a philosopher more seriously. They were sort of leaning towards him or relying on him, even just rhetorically or some sense, or even just for some sort of cultural critique framing or something, right? But I think that was an important moment, though, historically, because like in Western societies, I think the philosopher is a sort of intellectual academic figure, and he's very far away from politics. Like, you have advisors, they're industry advisors, or maybe you have some ethical advisors from think tanks, but they're not philosophers by any stretch of the imagination. So there's a much harsher distinction, I think, within the Western societies have developed, keeping the philosopher as a non-political actor, you know.
Well, I think what happened is that in intellectual history, if you go back to Hegel, then you see there's a line when philosophy was dismissed as the main authority, and instead science became the main authority. When science became the main authority, there's a niche underneath science called analytic philosophy, which is now the dominant philosophy in the American schools. And analytic philosophers are people like John Searle and so on, who deal with specific problems, specific set of problems. They're not thinkers that just like more like, Zizek is a thinker. He attacks all kinds of things. But the dominant meaning of philosophy in the vernacular um, means more like an academic who's involved in specific technical problems,
Yeah, so you got like a
such as the
specialization.
hard problem of consciousness or something, some things that stemming from Descartes and things like that, which are kind of polemical against the scientific worldview. But in any way, it interconnected with the scientific worldview rather than free thinking like Dugin and Zizek and Agamben and the guy you're studying, Barillo.
Yeah, so you got more
They're
of a,
more
yeah, like
thinkers.
specialization kind of, rather than generalization kind of dynamic going on there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's a set of problems they're compelled to deal with because it's almost like a political thing where you can't go too far away from the what's being done now because it would be meaningless and you'd be declared to be just talking nonsense, as the logical positives put it. You can't. You become, like Derrida gets the brunt of that a lot. He's the whipping boy of sort of this move away from those analytic philosophy problems into something that people just say, oh, well, we can't understand what you're talking about. So you guys are talking nonsense, like Chomsky's attack on Jesus. So,
Yeah. Like Chomsky attacking Zizek, because yeah, there's a reluctancy for people that have the capacity to kind of speculate off a general realm of topics and see kind of interconnected logics between them, and be able to sort of like rhetorically play around with all them, you know. You have to be And I think that's also got something to do with like industry training, people being trained not classically for life, but for
Well, yeah,
industry.
specialization, and yeah, also
Yeah.
that the universities have the main purpose of producing people for the job force, right? That's the main
Yeah.
purpose of the university today, rather, which wasn't the case, before, let's say, the year 1900 or so, especially before the French Revolution.
Mm. What about and so you have this displacement, at least in Western um society, of the more philosophical or even priestly role, and being replaced by the scientist. Um, and it would seem to me that, you know, to bring back the topics of like transhumanism or biogenetics, because on the Paul Virilio course I'm doing at the moment, we were discussing similar similar problems recently, like about like extreme science and the scientists kind of becoming Frankensteinian developers, you know. So you got like transgenic, so you got like art and science mixing together. I don't know if you've seen that guy on Twitter, Brian Johnson, who's like trying to stop himself aging.
No, I mean, I know that. Well, I mean, is he a doctor, like the Aubrey de Grey thing, or something different?
No, he's
This is
like
just a personal
he's like a billionaire who just
mission.
experiments with all
Oh,
these drugs and all these kind of health techniques to like stop himself aging, and he looks really weird
mm.
because he kind of looks like a CGI person. You know, he looks like an older person that's being CGI'd into a younger person's body or something. But anyway, he's a kind of Frankensteinian. He's a good example of like art and science sort of fusing together in this way. And I think that's an interesting
Oh
moment
yeah,
because it kind of undermines the authority of the scientist, because it's like, well, bourgeois science is not supposed to be for like, self cultivation, or like it's only supposed to be for like treating health issues or like solving kind of obvious practical problems, like material problems. It's not supposed to be used for like personal preferences or like ideological goals or anything like that. And but it seems to be happening more and more today that that authority is being undermined, I think, by by
I mean,
itself.
I think it's partial. I think again, I mean, I keep going back to this, is the fact value distinction, which makes no, when I say that, it makes no impression on people. But this is something that could be shown to be developed over, especially in the 19th century. Um, Once you get that distinction, then it feels like everything is subjective except like health and like living as long as possible. There's no building loses all its sense. Like personal education and improvement loses all its sense because it seems like hobby trivia. Oh, did you know like
Yeah.
some sports trivia or something? Everything becomes like that, like Jeopardy or whatever. But it loses its real substance, and it becomes like knowledge of popular culture. Like Schmidt is against, in the sense of being against entertainment culture. And Dugin's again. Dugin says, actually, Dugin made a specific remark on that. He says Zargrad television is enough. Like we should only have Zargrad television and then cut out everything else. Zargrad is like way more like Russian and victory party oriented than is RT, which is, the RT is way more pointed sort of towards impressing a Western audience prior to the sort of the uh, this third kind of or this new Cold War coming in more. Um, yeah, I think there's a basis of that kind of attitude in the scientific authority itself, and it's exactly the scientific authority which is sort of coming under question, as we were saying before, in this new media situation where we have this sort of, or we could do this sort of, this agony of these discussions, even if they get into the weeds to some extent, but maybe they can shine a light on some way out of those mindsets, and also to ridicule those mindsets to a certain. I mean, not ridicule them in the way. That's the way that Dawkins, like Richard Dawkins, takes, is to ridicule believers or whatever, but just to show that there's other things that are cogent, that make sense to thinking people, aside from this fact value scientific attitude. That other things. And also, again, I think it's the third time I stated it. I recommend that Mishima Yukio Mishima on the Defense of Culture article, because that points also towards a way you could see in a cogent way. People simply can't see anything but the scientific authority. That's the problem. And it leads to that attitude of, oh, I just want to live as long as possible, or I want to
Yeah.
like go into private sublime spirituality and just think about the afterlife or something.
Well, yeah, it's interesting kind of irony that the scientific authority asserting this fact value distinction sort of ends up blurring itself, because science is then used in this really funny way of like just living as long as possible, and using all these health techniques, like, the end of life is just to conjure up as much techniques which is going to stop you aging or something, like science is just wielded in these ways which
I can't
are
remember. I think maybe it was in a Gembin where he made this remark that either there's snobbishness, Japanese snobbishness, like the tea ceremony, or there's science, which is just like, because I think what he means is like there's cultural things like the tea ceremony, or it could be anything. It could be a certain kind of martial art. It could be um, Mishima's novels, or poetry that goes to a great depth of philosophic reflection. But any of those things that we could, from the point of view of fact value distinction, it seems like there's just a subjective preference, and you put your emotion in those, and that's the way Nietzsche depicts it. And then it's just random because you just happen to put your emotions in those. But the other way to look at it is this way that I'm trying to say is this Nietzschean um, Abgrund or abyss that stares back at us, which is we're taking the scientific view already in that sense and taking it to be true, and we're letting it stare back at us and tell us what reality is. But we could let something else stare back to us, and this is what Mishima is so close to it. He's so close to the edge of the, because it just happened in World War II, although it was already prepared by Commodore Perry and the things that happened in the 19th century. But the end of Japanese taking themselves seriously, being open to Japanese thought, being admiring courage, as Dugin would say. And actually, I have a good thing of Dugin is saying about that. But it's just that the culture can't look back into us, is the way of putting it, for whatever that's worth. Instead, it's just sitting there as a subjective thing and not as serious. And that's the problem. So since everything is subjective and not serious except science, then that's
yeah.
the logical conclusion.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. Like there's no objective value to culture. It's just a kind of consumer selection preferences, each to
Yeah.
their own sort of
And it's not really
object.
serious. It's not really serious. That's what Schmidt is talking about.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
the only thing that's really serious is this making weapons, sort of. And this, I don't know, Elon Musk transhumanism or whatever.
Yeah, again, Musk is a really good example of this, because he's kind of putting himself in this place of like this rejuvenator of a kind of failing liberal Western society, but he's like his only idea of like what's a good person, or like what are good aspirations, is like let's wire our brains to computers, or like drive
Yeah,
around
so to be more
in
efficient to
bulletproof
build
cars.
rockets or something.
like
Yeah, or card.
this card that he released recently, and you had all these guys on people like filming each other, like throwing rocks at the car, like, oh, look how durable it is, you can shoot it, like, and I'm just like, what is the point in this? Like, what is the point in this? But like it's basically perfect example of what you're describing, if like culture just loses its objective value, and then technology and science is the only thing objective, so like that becomes the like a car which is like bulletproof, even though that's not new by any means, but for some reason we pretend it is, and that becomes like a kind of rejuvenating force in society, and that's the next step towards a good culture or something, or like these are good aspirations. A man with a bulletproof car, he's a good man. you know
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've been thinking about, and I think it's serious, but nobody can seem to engage with it. But maybe there's just nothing to do with the thought. It's like as soon as you hear it, I don't, nobody knows what to do with the thought. But I just think with cell phones, like I keep thinking, like say, I know some people with like the latest iPhone or whatever, but it's like how many years can they keep coming out with a new iPhone or a new, I have a Google phone with a new Pixel phone or whatever? Is it going to be 300 years, 400 years? How long is that? Every year there's supposed to be an improved cell phone. How long could that go on? And that's this whole optimization notion. It spreads to every part of our existence, including our body, right? I think that's kind of one way to understand technological essence and enframing in the Heideggerian sense. Which is what Heidegger is saying is, this is the case, this is the way we're doing things, this is what we're the Agon that's staring into us in Nietzschean sense, but we have to find a way to negotiate with this situation and steer it back in a better way. And I think Dugin, whatever the difficulties of his position is, I think he's trying to work with that because he's working with the Heideggerian idea of Dasein and these notions.
Yeah, and like that's why I'm a little bit optimistic when I was referring to the kind of Jordan Peterson self-improvement stuff, because because for all its flaws, it does seem to be an attempt to understand like the human motivation or aspiration or a way of being, which isn't like let's have a bulletproof car or let's have the new iPhone. Like he does engage.
Yeah, I guess that's
archetypes and
stuff.
Yeah,
I think that is in like the old Enlightenment tradition. Peterson is still in the 19th century Enlightenment tradition in that. I think that's why I brought up again like Kant and this notion of because Kant's notion of the difference between society and state, which is the same as the difference of the social contract, is society is the sphere where you have freedom of speech and freedom to do this experiment in that direction, in that sense. So yeah, Peterson says, okay, I'm trying to sell my version of the truth. But there's a lot, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of critique of that's gone on since Kant's time that Peterson hasn't kind of faced up to, I think. Which is why I kind of feel justified in saying, Peterson, his level of thinking is not that and other similar things where I think he's not sort of doing what Germans call Auseinandersetzung, or just like really confronting, facing up to the best thoughts on these issues, which the tradition had past Kant, Hegel, and so on have brought out, and which if we don't face up to them, we're just like Peterson, we're kind of autistic in a way, because we don't see all the thoughts that the thinkers that are the most serious have brought out on these issues, and which are really cogent. So that's why I think then when I go to Strauss or Heidegger, I see somebody who has thought through everything that follows from those issues.
Yeah. And I think like just to comment on the Peterson stuff as well, that like there tends to be a kind of therapeutic inclination to try breathe meaning back into people's lives, but without structuring anything around like objective priorities or values. Like it kind of falls again into this sort of flat horizontal selection of values. Like if that's meaningful to you, you're a subject, and your subjectivity should be sort of respected. And if you like, I don't know if
he's talking about subjectivity, then he's caught in the heavy gravity of the fact value distinction. That's one of his big problems, because he has the scientific training, and he accepts that as like a permanent division.
I think another result of that, like another result of that is, I don't know if you know Gordon Ramsay. He's a chef in the UK, and he's just like, he's like this really angry chef, and like I just don't know how a man can project that much meaning into cooking, but it's kind of the result of this kind of whatever it is, this lack of objective values. Because if everyone's sort of just interests or hobbies are equally important, then and like I do think like the kind of therapeutic logic is, like if this person's a chef and they're depressed and they want meaning, and if they decide to like project like loads of meaning and motivation, this is kind of what Jordan Peterson does with people, but into that practice, well then that's what they should do. That will help them, and there's no kind of
it's like this.
like
It's like this
objective.
guy that says everything is placebo effect. Everything is placebo. I mean, in a certain
Yeah.
way, it's true. Like if you hear the wine costs, $500, and it literally tastes better. They show in your neurons there's more pleasure neurons firing or whatever they're called.
Yeah,
So
and I mean
there's a
like
placebo effect ideas.
in in a medieval society, like I just can't imagine that happening. Like I can't imagine people projecting that much kind of enthusiasm for cooking. Like I just think that they probably had a more structured understanding of values.
Well,
Like,
also, it wasn't just a matter of enthusiasm. It was a matter of like Alan McFarland, the Cambridge anthropologist, says there's two countries that are really good at cuisine, is France and China. And it's like, just to use the meaning of the word in the vernacular, it's objective. Like you can see they're just given more thought to their cuisine than I think than Britain, for instance. But I mean, maybe you could tell me better. But I think like it seems like the British haven't thought about their cuisine as well as the Chinese and the French.
no, they haven't. But I mean, even to project that much thought into cuisine, you've got to have like a kind of distortion in your
A
values
passion or something.
because
Oh yeah.
but like because it's kind of like how did that become important? It's like, if you think of medieval
Well, I don't
society.
know if it's a distortion because like the thing is in play. I think that's a big issue in Plato as the division thinks of the polis as having a division of labor, right? So there's some people that should be cooks, and they should be cook as they should be good cooks, whereas we say like since we can't plan the country as a whole, everybody has a certain independence from the whole, and therefore everybody's not doing what's good for the whole in the Platonic sense of the division of labor. Some people are cooks, some people are soldiers, some people are farmers, whatever. But that everybody is doing the invisible hand thing, their rationality eventually supposedly ending up in good results. So if everybody's doing their individual thing rather than fulfilling an organ,
Yeah.
rather than being an organ of society, then it's like then that kind of stuff starts to seem like outliers and crazy stuff. Like somebody just gets intense into something that nobody else cares about, or that it's not good for society.
Yeah, well, that it kind of reminds me of Marx's fetishism. Like you don't see the interconnected relations between a society. You just see like the one specific thing. And then the thing kind of gets this kind of theological dimension to it because people are all just projecting like this insane level of value into like these one things rather than seeing them as like a part of a whole, if you get me, which is kind of just a product of like the lack of shared values or and like
And
I
maybe
don't.
just of the size of society, because the
Yeah,
number of people in society is so great.
yeah, I suppose it's more difficult to actually conduct like that within a very large society, especially like a global society. Yeah, I can't think of anything else to touch on. Do you have anything else? Do you wanted
Okay, let me
to?
just end with one remark that I thought was sort of provocative or sort of suggestive, I guess. Is Dugin has made this remark in a recent interview that Italian people respond very not specific Italian people, but Italians in general respond very well to his teachings.
Yeah,
And he gave the example of a kind of group of Italians who sort of spontaneously, after the death of Daria Dugina, or Platonova, she's also called his daughter, who was, of course, assassinated for political reasons. They produced one of them was a known is a known musician in I forget his name in Italy. He produced an opera that was performed like 3 times so far, and then a bunch of them produced books. And Dugin said these people they can't be Europeans. They must be something
yeah,
else.
I heard that
And
interview.
so,
Yeah,
yeah, and so then he said, yeah, maybe they're Romans. So I thought that was brilliant because it's like this idea of they say with regard to Heidegger, der Kehrer, that's not the ordinary German. Drea is ordinary German for like dreidel is ordinary German for turn. But there's this idea of that one can turn from one culture to another, and therefore Dugin wants to turn from liberal culture to something else. But I thought that's a good example of the current Italians to Romans, and then with those people that he says are open and what does he say? Open and serious and recognizing what courage is, and very different from a kind of commercial person who's it was looking at who's a modern European. So I guess that's how I bookend the issue, and I guess I think it's like oh, let me mention one more thing is like the philosopher king itself in Plato is very it's not a translucent issue. There's very opaque in some ways, and there's places to scratch it. Like Plato himself, probably one thing the city in the Republic is called Caliopolis, which is the Calon. So it's not after the good, but it's after the specific thing. It's like the beautiful city. It's not the full city, and it's contrasted with what's said in the laws. In the laws, they mention sort of like philosopher king. They mention Nestorus or Nestor from the Republic, who's I mean, sorry, from the Iliad, who's supposed to be known as a wise king. Although the thing is, in the interesting thing, which makes sort of a powerfully nuanced little wrinkle there, is that Nestor is sort of not wise according to Plato, and the examples Plato and Socrates give of him, and they kind of show that Nestor, who is known as a wise king, is kind of questionable. And so I think in the same way, the whole notion of the philosopher king is already to Plato himself is somewhat questionable, but we see how philosophers can nonetheless influence political people, and that I think Dugin maybe is more oriented towards that Caesar Christ split in the way he thinks of himself, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, fair. I think
Because of Putin
yeah,
is being a Caesar. But
yeah. Like I definitely think the question of like the philosopher king as like this clear cut authority who is a philosopher and literally a king and rules is obviously like we probably need to come at it from a little bit more of a nuanced perspective than that. But I definitely do think that historically speaking, as you were saying earlier, the kind of scientific authority and that fact value distinction, which it constantly reinforces, is I think in the 21st century, like we're in quite a good position to attack that, to challenge that, and in that
yeah,
sense,
something,
the philosopher
the
king
same thing doesn't have to
might
always happen.
emerge. Yeah, like
Yeah,
in that sense,
something new could
there's
happen.
room because I couldn't
We're in a
imagine that happening
new
100 years
time.
ago. Yeah,
Yeah, time is open. We think so much as in a closed way.
yeah. That's what I'm saying. Like it's more open than I think 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Like today, it seems to be more open, which fits into the whole Dugin fourth
Yeah, maybe we're
theory.
all becoming more philosophic too. That's the other thing,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
of all these social media connects everyone to these discussions.
yeah, definitely.